No, you look good. I can see
Yeah,
you.
so do you. Here we go. So hi, this is Henri Fauteux of La Maison du 21e siècle, 21st Century Housing Magazine based in Quebec. And today I'm very pleased to speak to Theodora Scarato, who's Executive Director of Environmental Health Trust. I hope I pronounced your name well.
Yes, Theodora Scarato.
So thanks for being with us today. Theodora, we've exchanged so many emails and crossed paths a few times, but we never really had time to sit down. So let's do a good hour today. Tell me first a little bit about yourself and the Environmental Health Trust.
Well, the Environmental Health Trust is a scientific think tank, and it was founded by Dr. Devra Davis and other scientists focused on environmental health risks, which are preventable. They both were raising awareness on environmental health, how to reduce exposure to environmental exposures that can be harmful, as well as publishing research and also educating policymakers from a decade ago. And now our organization, Environmental Health Trust, is still working on environmental health issues, but we are focused on 5G and cell phone radiation because it's become an urgent issue and, so pervasive, a new kind of environmental pollution. And we really need more environmental health organizations working on this. So that's been our focus over the last few years.
But I'm curious, Devra was an advisor to President Clinton on chemical pollution. How did she and yourself become aware of this important issue?
Well, if you go to her 2000 and I think 12 talk at the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, she talks about how she learned about this issue while she was working on other environmental health, plastics. She's long worked on plastics, climate, pesticides, lead. In fact, if there's an environmental exposure, you name it, she worked on it, including smoking in airplanes.
Mm.
And she talks about learning about this and realizing that the government really dropped the ball in terms of adequately reviewing the safety of cell phones before they were brought on the market and the safety of cell towers before they were brought on the market. So she has been at this for many years. I got involved in about 2013 and started volunteering with Environmental Health Trust and just began doing more and more. And now I am really focused on policy because the United States and Canada, unfortunately, are really behind when you look at what other countries are doing. Now, we haven't completely gotten there worldwide, but we certainly can look to other government actions to protect the public as role models for where we should at least be, and then we can go further. So in France, for example, they are calling for and have a new directive to label products, cell phones, to say keep away from the abdomen, keep away from the pregnant, from pregnancy, and also teenagers' abdomen. That's actually in their law. Cyprus has a campaign, a nationwide campaign on how to reduce exposure to cell phone radiation, and they did a pilot program taking Wi-Fi out of Archbishop Macario's hospital in the pediatric and neonatal units, as another example. French Polynesia has a campaign where they educate on how to reduce cell phone exposure and also other non-ionizing radiation exposures. So that is what I've been focusing on, is really elevating the conversation on this so that we can move forward and have safe technology for everyone. And that's our webpage on a worldwide policy, where we have a sampling of what's happening around the world, like Belgium, where it is illegal for retail stores to sell mobile phones designed for children younger than 7. And they actually have pictures of those phones. And they did that to reduce radiation exposure to children.
This is really surprising, someone who's never heard of this. We've never seen such work, what you're doing, following, tracking every country and cities. When we hear from the World Health Organization, Health Canada, the FCC or FDA in the US. Everything is always no problem, there's no proof. How can it, there's like an omerta, you know, it's like in French, in Quebec, we say silence radio. It's like they shut off your station, you're not hooked up to the information. And there was a report out of Harvard University saying that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the US, is a captured agency. Is it really, you know, because in these times of COVID, the media, general media is saying, oh, everyone is talking conspiracies, 5G, it's not scientific, it's all bogus. How do you navigate through all this?
We just try to put forward science-based facts. So we have a page on our site. We have several pages dedicated to scientific studies that have been published that show that link exposures to radio frequency or non-ionizing radiation to a variety of harmful effects, everything from cancer. There was just a Yale study that found increased thyroid cancer in people with genetic susceptibilities. There are impacts to sperm and reproduction. There's research out of Kaiser Permanente that found prenatal exposure to non-ionizing radiation, which is supposed to be, which industry will say is safe and no discussion, there's no science, but they
The
found,
damaged DNA, they said.
yeah, the National Toxicology Program found damaged DNA, and Kaiser Permanente found that when women are exposed prenatally to magnetic fields, that those with the higher levels of magnetic non-ionizing radiation had increased obesity, asthma, and ADHD in their babies, and they also had a higher miscarriage rate. So, and with wireless and cell phone radiation, there's damaged memory that's been found. There's altered brain activity that's been found, that also from Yale in a study on mice. Brain damage. So many studies, in fact, thousands of studies that show adverse effects related to wireless and non-ionizing radiation exposure. And yet, I think Canada has not looked at the science since 2016, right? Your last Safety Code 6 evaluation, if I'm correct, was.
There's you probably know Frank Clegg, the former president of Microsoft Canada, who's behind Citizens for Safe Technology in Canada.
Mhm.
They had public hearings, Health Canada, or there was a review of Safety Code 6 on radio frequency exposure. And it turns out that Health Canada simply ignored more than 100 studies which went against the opinion of its scientists, it seems.
Right.
I think it's really interesting to say that Ron Melnick, that I'm showing here, is a scientific advisor with you. He devised the US NTP rat study. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because the FDA, which financed or demanded this study, was downplaying it since then, since it was published, saying that the rats were overly exposed, much more than any humans would be. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that study was designed to ask the question, are there non-thermal effects from chronic seemingly low level exposure to wireless radiation? Cell phone modulations were used specifically in that study, and Dr. Melnick led the design of that study at NIH. He's a 28-year NIH scientist, now retired. So the FDA asked for these studies because in their nomination, they said, we're not going to know what the effect will be to humans for decades, and we can't experiment in humans. So we would like some animal studies. The study comes out and finds clear evidence of cancer, DNA damage, damage to the heart, and actually many other elevations in tumors. And the FDA is rejecting it and saying the exposures were too high, or they're also saying that it's an animal study and can't be applied to humans. Now, of course, animals are not humans, but we test drugs in animals in order to see what effects are in biological systems. And all the animals were exposed to levels which simply should not have caused harm. They were non-thermal levels. If you look at the NTP study, there's actually several parts to it. And the first two parts were about determining what is a level at which a thermal or elevation of heating will happen, which causes those harm from heating. And they made sure that the animals were exposed to levels that were lower than that. And they're very comparable to the exposure you'd get when you put the phone to your head, that intense level of exposure, except they did all over the body to see how different tissues would respond. And I'll note that in the United States, we actually have a really ridiculous way that we have our limits set, but we have an occupational exposure from cell phones, and all the animals were exposed to levels lower than that occupational localized threshold.
Mhm.
So Dr. Melnick has published several times on how the criticisms that are thrown up against the NTP study, how they are unfounded.
Oh,
And
so there was an independent review panel that confirmed the findings.
that's right.
Mhm,
And they actually elevated the findings to clear evidence of cancer in the male rats.
mhm.
And later on, the DNA findings were published showing DNA damage in mice and rat groups in different tissues.
And these were schwannomas, tumors of the myelin, which is the insulation around nerves. In the rats, it was in the hearts, notably. But in humans, we're finding schwannomas in the head, a similar
In
tumor.
the hearing nerve, yes, acoustic neuromas would be a comparable cell type in humans.
Mhm.
Yep,
That's in,
to the schwannomas of the heart found. And then there was the Ramazzini Institute study. So when people criticized the National Toxicology Program because the exposures were too high, and by the way, they were intended to be that high to challenge the animals. But then the Ramazzini Institute did a study where they used much lower levels of radio frequency wireless radiation. And
simulating cell tower, isn't it?
it was designed to mimic a base station's or cell tower levels, and they found the same tumors that the National Toxicology Program
Which are
found.
very rare, rare tumors.
So so we have the same tumors being
Mhm.
found in animals and similar tumor types in humans who use cell phones for long term. This is a wake up call, and it's only one piece of a bigger puzzle.
Mhm.
The Swiss expert group just published their report on oxidative stress. And oxidative stress, as Dr. Melnick talks about actually in a lot of his publications as well, it is considered a hallmark of cancer. And it can lead to a myriad and contribute to a myriad of other illnesses and health effects in people. So if radio frequency radiation is linked to oxidative stress, and that Swiss reports concludes that children and the elderly are most at risk from the effects. The
Mhm.
majority of studies have found oxidative stress, that have looked into oxidative stress, have found a positive result from exposure.
Mhm.
So,
Let's talk about these limits. You mentioned the thermal effect. Uh, so it's an international body, the ICNIRP, which is advising countries around the world, and countries basically buy into their theory that if you have a thermal effect, you can harm
mhm.
biology. And if it's non-thermal, it's not conclusive that there is harm. Wasn't that developed by the US Army or the US Air Force in the 60s?
Well, it's a it's really a tragic story as to what happened because the public health was left by the wayside. But after the Cold War, there began a lot of investigations into the issue of radio frequency. Why really it was looking at radar exposure to our military personnel, as well as in Russia, China, and around the world. Um, so the limits were initially designed to protect our service people. And the body dummies, the way that they looked at in testing were military recruits, big men with very big heads. And the EPA was actually tasked with developing federal safety standards in the United States, the United States Environmental Protection Agency. But in 1996, they were fully defunded from actually setting and developing safety limits. And instead, we adopted limits from industry filled groups. And what you're looking at now is the way that we test devices, which is all based on thermal, and heating is the only harm. So here you have the body dummy, and then there's liquid. There's like this special liquid inside, and this is like a big thermometer that takes a temperature that looks at heating only. And the key thing for everyone to know about this is that heating is not the only harm from wireless radio frequency radiation. Yes, it's microwaves. We don't want to heat our brain. We don't want to cook our tissue. So the limits were set so that we don't cook tissue. However, heating is not the only harm. And actually, wireless technology exposure is very different than microwave oven exposure because they are information carrying waves. And modulated wireless frequencies have been found to be especially efficient at having biological effects. That's been shown in research.
So explain to us modulation, it's pulsations.
The pulsations, the data rate, these characteristics of the wave that make them unique are.
These are microwaves that are being turned on and off continuously at high speed.
Yes, and also there's data on the waves that make it that modulate the wave. It's not just about the
There's about 100 frequencies, I think. Igor
What?
Belaya was telling me you may have 100 different frequencies being emitted by your cell phone. So the body has to adapt.
That's right. So there's a carrier wave that you often hear about, like 900 megahertz, and that's the wave that the main wave we hear when you look up what frequencies will 5G use, or what frequencies are on my cell phone, or what frequency is Wi-Fi. But there's actually the information is on the wave, and there are much more going on any one frequency. So that's just the carrier wave. Then there's information carried on the wave.
Isn't that also a problem when they do lab studies? They use a pure wave, which doesn't have all these different frequencies and also interference and what have you, as in the real world.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what scientists are publishing on in terms of the challenges you'll often hear, well, there's studies that have been inconclusive, or they found an effect and then another study didn't find an effect. But a lot of studies didn't even look at information carrying waves, or there were other electromagnetic field exposures that could have been happening in the experimental case that were unaccounted for.
Mm-hmm.
So the research that we have that underpins the limits that we have in the United States, it's not from 1996. It's actually from 10 years and more prior. These are antiquated studies that were used to develop the limits that we have in place. And so much has changed since 1996. I mean, we didn't have every kid in the United States of America almost with a smartphone.
Yeah.
We didn't have Wi-Fi in all the schools. We didn't have these smart speakers and so-called small cells right in front of bedroom windows.
Mm-hmm.
Back then. No one could have imagined what's happened.
And Paul Leroux, the physicist who teaches the toxicology of EMFs at McGill to future physicians, told me that now I think there's 5 or 6 rat studies that prove cancer, dating way back to the what was the name? Another U.S. military study was the first one, I think. Finding a link with cancer and cell phone radiation.
There are several. I know
mm-hmm.
several studies that have found connections. And all of the independent case control studies that have been done that looked at people who put cell phones to the head long term have found increases after 10 years of use, or in some cases, and I know there's a team that just came out with a study, a review of the issue last year, 17 minutes a day for 10 years.
Yeah.
So,
And I saw that South Korea just backed up that study saying there is a link. That was the Moskowitz review, right?
yes, and there's also research out that, well, there's a study, a review of electromagnetic fields in children by the Korean government as well, where they recommend that there be reductions in exposure to kids. And in fact, the government has, they have a whole thing. We have it on our website, on our international actions on under in Korea, showing that they show you how to keep the phone away from your head. They have entire pages dedicated to educating the public
In the
about
country of
this issue.
Samsung.
Hmm?
In the country of Samsung. Samsung is based in South Korea.
Oh, I don't know about that in
No,
specifically. I was talking about the Korean. Here, I'll pull it up.
no, but Samsung, the cell phone manufacturer, isn't it Samsung?
Right. I didn't know.
Yeah. So South Korea, the cell phone industry is very powerful in South
I
Korea.
imagine.
So they haven't prevented them from doing that.
Well, it's not saying it's not as far as it needs to go, but what's amazing is compared to the United States, they're light years ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, they're saying they actually recommend that children minimize their use of cell phones.
Can you share it? Do you have the page?
Sure, I will. Give me a second
I wanted to
to.
show the legal RF exposure information on the Apple website after. People have to understand that many of these studies, you have to read the annexes at the end, because they'll conclude that there's no increased risk of tumor. And then they say, well, if you look at the same side of the head in long-term users, that's where the risk will double. So the French Serenat study, Interphone, you really have to look at the fine print, which Lou's lesson of microwave news taught us to look at.
I'm
Okay,
sharing with you a web page here. And I actually have it so Google is automatically translating what they say.
cool.
And here they're talking about keep it at a distance from the body. Now, again, this does not protect you to keep it at 5 millimeters. However, what we know is that phones are not even tested at body contact. And if you want to meet the limits that we have, which are inadequate to protect us, but still are limits, you need to actually keep it at a distance. Here they say, the Electronics and Telecommunications Research Institute recommends that children refrain from using mobile phones based on research results on children.
Wow, ever.
Yeah. Here's another one. We don't actually think that this is protective, but they do recommend it's safer to switch between the right and left sides of the face than to speak on one side of the face. Now, this is Google translated, so that's what we're getting.
To balance your exposure. Yeah.
Not to sleep by the phone. And then if you go, let's see if I can't go to the other. Whoops. I have to go to the. They have a whole section for kids. So it normally translates after a minute, but not everything translates.
Okay. Well, we get
Um,
the idea, people. So that's in policies on your website.
yeah, we link to it on the international page. Let me get that up so I can show you where that is.
Mhm.
What
So
happened is I have to open in a different browser because the Google Translate only happens in one, not
that's
the
okay.
other.
So
So
I can explain while you're doing that. Okay, here we go. Yeah,
Okay, yeah, you can, I'll show you some of this here.
international, Korea. Okay.
So on this page, they also have a regulation that the SAR labels be affixed to devices, which,
Okay, but that can lead to a false sense of security. Let's get back to that SAR testing. I'd like to show, if you want to let me share, um, the Apple page.
oh, please do.
Yeah, here we go. So here they explain that to simulate use against the head, there's no separation. That means they don't have a 5 millimeter separation against the head.
Well, that is a little trick that I can explain to you, but read the rest and then I'll explain that.
Okay, go ahead.
When they say they simulate use against the head, they are talking about holding the phone up to the head, but not touching where the brain is. They actually have a spacer for the ear that creates a separation between this part of your head. And so it's not actually touching against your skull.
And a
And
five
if you see, it
millimeter
says with
separation
5 millimeter separation from the body,
to make
because
a
it's never
difference.
touching. It's not actually like this, where it's touching your skin above your skull. There's a spacer for the ear.
Okay, and that'll make a world of a difference. That
It
did.
makes a world of a difference, actually. Yes.
So let's talk about Marc Arazi's work. He's a French doctor who founded PhoneGate Alert, and now you've partnered with them. Tell us a bit what the French government found when they tested phones.
So what Dr. Mark Arazi found is that the government was testing hundreds of cell phones at body contact, unbeknownst to the public. Now, this is important because, like I said, the phones are not tested at body contact. There's a spacer when it's called the head position. And then they don't have phones tested like people use them in their bra, in their spandex pants, in their pants or in their shirt pocket. No, they're not tested that way. But France was doing it. That information was kept undercover until he put pressure on the government to release the numbers. What were the measurements that the government found? And what they found, what was ultimately released through all the pressure that he put on the country, was that the majority of phones
9 out of
exceeded,
10, 90%.
yeah, they exceeded government limits.
The,
And when
the
they were at body
thermal,
contact,
the thermal limit, the heating effect.
the limit that had been set based on the thermal effect.
Mhm.
And those numbers are now all online. The French government actually has posted all of that information, oops, so that you can see it. And they are now stating that they're going to start measuring the radiation on other wireless devices.
Mhm.
But let me go back to the phone for a second. Dr. Om Gandhi, who helped develop these thermally based limits years ago, who's now one of our scientific advisors, he published showing that children have more absorption of radio frequency proportionate to adults, actually. But he took the numbers from the French government, the measurements that were taken as to the cell phone radiation, and found that if you used the way the United States does our measurements, that actually those phones tested in France would have exceeded US limits by up to 11 times.
Mm.
And it's being called PhoneGate, kind of like Dieselgate, because it's a fraudulent test. The way we test is wrong. Phones should be tested touching the body. How many people do you see who take the phone and go like that? And they, I mean, how many mothers taking care of their babies put the phone like that? So you've got your neck, your thyroid, it's going right here. It's not on the ear even, it's behind the ear.
Mhm.
Or people go like this all the time. You ever see that? People are talking on the phone and they hold it like that. Well, there are antennas
Yeah, on the top.
on the phone here and here. Well, in the tests that are being used, those those antennas are not touching the head.
You mentioned the bras also. There are some pretty nasty scans out there showing tumors, multiple tumors in very young women carrying cell phones in their bras.
Yes, there are published case studies of young women with no history of breast cancer in their family, who are young, but they held the phone in their bra for hours a day, and they're developing unusual tumor formations that are right under where the antennas in their cell phone would be.
Okay, now we've scared people enough. Tell us what you recommend people do. And maybe it's important to stress that the American Academy of Pediatrics would like to see non-thermal exposure guidelines, right?
Well, when our government launched an inquiry into our outdated limits that were set in 1996, the American Academy of Pediatrics wrote to the FCC recommending that our limits be reevaluated to protect children, because the way we measure phones, like we just talked about, are not the way we use them. And also the metrics, the SAR limit, this thermally based limit, is not necessarily a limit which can evaluate biological effects. So they wrote that information to the FCC. After the National Toxicology Program came out with their study finding clear evidence of cancer, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with 10 tips on how families can reduce exposure. And
show that.
yeah, so they are, keep the phone away from your head. Don't carry it on your body, because they even say they can't guarantee what the level of radiation you'll be exposed to is. Goes back to PhoneGate. They recommend that if you have a tablet or a device, don't stream the video. Instead, have a pre-downloaded video or whatever it is you want your child to watch on it. So we are thankful that they've done this. And I will.
Before we get to the tips, they said the data was not yet completed. The analysis. What date was this?
This is outdated. It's from 2016, so it hasn't been updated yet.
Because
we're hoping that they'll update it.
There was that independent review which found the clear evidence. Okay, so the tips are given here.
This was done in 2016, actually. This was the final reports on the NTP was in 2018. So this page hasn't been updated. However, it still has recommendations on how to reduce exposure that really make sense. I would add even more to this list.
Such as?
Well, using wired, not wireless computers, which, laptops and all of your devices can be hardwired rather than wireless. Can I share my screen and show you our website?
Go.
Okay, let me pull up.
I always tell people, do you need to walk around with your tablet, in your house? You can sit down and have an Ethernet cable, can't you? I said, well, that's true. But we have a daily in Montreal that you can only read on an iPad. So I tell people, well, there's a little adapter you can buy to plug it into your modem.
That's right. There's adapters. There's even adapters for your cell phone.
Yeah.
So that you can, yeah.
Surf, not to make phone calls. So.
When my kids come over, I have them use this so that they can still connect with their phone for most of the applications, but they can do it through the Ethernet we have in the house. And they turn the antennas off, the Bluetooth off, the Wi-Fi off, the LTE, all those antennas off, and just connect with the Ethernet. But we have a page on technology at home. You want to identify the sources in your home. It's sort of the first step. It's like with eating, if you're making a change in your food, you first need to kind of figure out, what am I even eating, and what do I need to change? So identify the sources, and then you can take steps to swap out. That's right. Yeah, get a meter too. Oh, I don't have my meter in front of me. That's really important.
I was doing a Zoom yesterday and showing how my house is great. You know, it's green blinking. This is the best you can get according to the building biology recommendations, which were endorsed by the European Council.
Mhm.
And so I turned it on and it was in the red. It was extreme. And I was wondering what the hell. So I'm looking at my Wi-Fi, Bluetooth on my computer. Everything's turned off. I never have any wireless, but I have a new modem. We have, I live an hour north of Montreal in the woods, and it took us 20 years to get fiber optics. We've had it for a few weeks. And I just transferred my business, the 1-800 line at home. So we went from a residential to a commercial package with our TV, phone, and internet company. And they gave me not optional, but automatic Wi-Fi without telling me last week when they turned it on. So I'm glad. Very often I talk to people and I turn on my meter to tell them, oh, it's wonderful. I'm like 8 kilometers from the cell towers. So people really need to have such meters. If we could show it actually, SLT out of Ontario is the principal supplier for all of North America. They make this meter, the Safe and Sound in Ontario, and tested, of course, by independent labs and what have you, but they also distribute for gigahertz solutions, the German manufacturer who's backed actually by the German government and German courts and what have you. So I really recommend people buy even the affordable meters for about 200 meters dollars, because if you don't measure, you're not going to know what your exposure is, of course.
And what you brought out is really important because that's happened to many people where they think they've turned off the Wi-Fi, but it's still on, the antennas are still on, or maybe the Bluetooth is on, and you can really catch things by finding a meter so that you can find the sources in your house. I think it's critically important. Also, if you've made changes, you can verify that you're still, that things are still turned off. And also your home phone. Do I have an example of a corded phone? You don't want to use a home cordless phone. Cordless phones emit all the time. So swapping out, this is mine, my phone that has a cord.
I pull it up just to do a test. I stopped using this baby about 15 years ago. And it was impressive to see Magda Havis and others found heart arrhythmia with these phones. So here I've got the bass turned on. I don't have the phone itself.
Right.
So here we go. Extreme. So people don't realize it's about what, 500 feet or so that it emits all over your house 24/7. It's not something you really want to live with. Let's talk cell towers, Theodora.
So talk cell towers.
How close are you? I'm 8 kilometers away.
Oh no, I'm in the DC area. I'm lucky to be a fourth mile away, I'm afraid.
Oh, I want to mention first, at the first EMF conference in 2019, where we met, Peter Sirk was telling me that, I think it was him saying that some architects will hide the Wi-Fi emitters, the routers or modems, behind drywall in some condos.
Mm-hmm.
I found that nearly criminal. I mean, if you do that and you have a kid right next to it 24/7, I couldn't believe. So they're really not aware, these building professionals, about
They
this.
really need to be aware. I think it should just be code to have Ethernet connections, just like we have plugs and where do plugs go, that Ethernet connections be put in, as well as phone lines, so that we're not retrofitting, because that's what's happening now. For me to get my corded landline and Ethernet, I hired an electrician to put that in, and that's just absolutely not it's an environmental justice issue. I mean, it costed me money. Who's going to afford to do this? Um, some people will, and some people won't. So
Well,
we, we're working on 5G now at Environmental Health Trust because that's going to mean hundreds of thousands of new cell towers called small cells that are being put up in front of homes, right directly in front of schools, 10, 20, 30 feet. In my community, in the cities, you're allowed to have a tower, an antenna 10 feet from a building. So that's 10 feet from someone's bedroom window
yeah. And that's in addition to the 3G and 4G antennas that are going to keep.
that are already in place. Right. So this is building science and radio frequency radiation, what makes smart and healthy buildings. And this is a paper that I co-authored along with Frank Clegg, a former Microsoft Canada president, Dr. Anthony Miller, Margaret Friedson, Cindy Russell, as well as Rob Metzinger, and others. And it really goes into everything from not being near a cell tower because a cell tower will impact the level of radio frequency you're exposed to if it's near your window especially, or you're in line of sight, but also the importance of hardwiring internet connections within the building. And it reviews the science, and it has different sections. So one is on how there's so much science, a significant body of science showing adverse effects at levels that are below FCC and international, ICNIRP limits. And then it talks about legal liability issues, what's happening around the world. That's the part that I worked on. And then what are recommendations for building professionals? So this is Building an Environment, which is an industry journal on environment and building.
People have to understand also Dr. Miller, who is one of your advisors. I think he's about 90 years old. I invited him to Montreal a few years ago. He headed the National Cancer Institute Division of Epidemiology for 15 years in Toronto in the 70s and the 80s. And when the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified radiofrequency radiation as possibly carcinogenic in 2011, it was Dr. Miller who was asked to review the references put forth by the committee. So he's really one of the top epidemiologists in the world. And
Right.
he says if you look at the figures, the biostatistics, for him, it's a clear link to cancer. Now, not everyone agrees with him, but everyone I'm speaking to, from Russia to Australia, all the scientists, and Dr. Grigoriev, most of them say, well, we know it's a probable carcinogen, so it's supposed to go up since the Ramazzini and US NTP studies in 2018. IARC is supposed to convene a new panel of experts to review the science. And I don't know when it's going to be done and who's going to be on that panel, because now they're making sure that all of the activists is the way they're presenting Dr. Miller, a great scientist like Dr. Hardell, who's done the best studies on cell phone and cancer. They've been turned down as candidates for this committee. Are you aware a little bit about where this is going?
Well, I know that the advisory committee recommended that there be an evaluation within the next 5 years.
2 to 4
So,
years, yeah.
yeah, I mean, will it happen? I certainly hope so. The World Health Organization EMF project, which is a separate entity, is also doing a monograph. And I know Dr. Hardell's team and other independent experts of Environmental Health Trust were turned down from being a part of that as well. Now, something that people don't know is that the World Health Organization EMF project, which is different than the International Agency for the Research on Cancer, that as far as we can tell, their last review of the science was from 1993. So anything on their page
Incredible.
All these fact sheets which say there's no adverse effects is based on
Well, for
what?
electrosensitivity, it's 2005, so that's 16 years that they have updated their data.
And their data is based on what? That's what we wrote Dr. Deventer about this, and she has not answered our question. We've asked, is it not true that 1993 was the last review? Who wrote the fact sheets? Because there's these fact sheets online that everyone, used to defend the rollout of 5G and to defend wireless in schools and to defend the safety of wireless. Except I think we need to look under the covers as to where did this information come from? Because at the same time, we have the International Agency for the Research on Cancer, which is saying it's a possible carcinogen back in now a decade ago, and we have this new research. What's going on? And you know who I want to mention in the paper too is Margaret Sears of Prevent Cancer Now and
Mhm.
Alex Dandler. But I know, Prevent Cancer Now is doing such incredible work, and she contributed so much to that paper. Um, so I'm just thankful that all of these groups came together and experts to put it all together in one, which is what's the problem and what's the solution for buildings.
It's nice to see you partnering with Canadians and people in Europe. I've been reading microwave news since the early 1990s, after the New York Power Lines project uh,
Mhm.
review. They financed Dr. Carpenter of Albany University got $5 million from the New York State because they wanted to buy power from Quebec. And that power line project was turned down based on those studies. So if I could share, I've got a great article here from 2005. When the World Health Organization reviews data, they always have their text proof by industry. So here they did it for power lines with people from power companies, and we had Dr. Plout from Quebec, from Hydro-Quebec. And speaking to experts, who would think of publishing a scientific paper by having it read by the polluter? It's incredible. That's how the World Health Organization works. Uh, and who funds the WHO also? Bill Gates, I think now is he the top or the second funder of
I
WHO?
don't know.
When
I
the
don't.
when Trump pulled out the US funding, I think Gates became the top funder.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of politics. My background is in political science.
Mhm.
It's really interesting to see what's happening behind the scenes. If we finally talk about cell towers, how far away do you have to be from a cell tower to be safe? That's a general question.
Well, that's a really good question. And I think that now I can't answer that. What I do know is that it does not seem to be safe to be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200, 300 feet from these new installations. And I say that based on the data that's been presented as to the levels that people are getting with all of these new installations that are close to homes.
Seeing this page by Physicians for Safe Technology that I'm sharing?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Can you see this page?
Yeah, I can. I can see it just fine. Yep.
Okay, good. So this is also one of my favorite
Mhm.
websites. Cindy Russell of California,
Yes.
physician there, is really following this issue. And I think most studies, is it a dozen studies saying that there are more cancers and more different symptoms, sleeping problems up to 500 meters, I think, from cell towers.
Well, there are several studies that have looked at people who live closer to towers and antennas and further. There was that study that was just published that had 80 meters as their cutoff and found DNA damage in the blood. I mean, there are many different studies that have found different things from cancer to headaches to neurological problems to increased death from cancer. There was just a recent study out of Brazil that found more cancer mortality closer to the cell installations.
Mhm.
It's sort of like a never-ending list of studies that we find showing effects, peer-reviewed, published science, and yet we hear that there is no evidence from industry and even from some governments when there is plenty of evidence.
Well, Dr. Belayev, with whom I did an interview recently, told me years ago that it, it could be any device, but we're talking about smart meters at a time. He was saying it can cause or cure disease. It's like radiation,
Mhm.
X-rays. It will depend on a lot of factors, of course, but the dose and the duration of exposure. So electricity can help you, but since you're electrical, you better not play with it too much because it feeds disease, is what I understand from reading
Yeah,
all.
I mean, there are effects, there are biological effects that happen, biochemical changes from exposure to non-ionizing radiation. So that can be used to heal even brain cancer. They're looking at uh, treatments for brain cancer that involve non-ionizing radiation, tumor treating fields. I've seen some research on liver cancer, but that doesn't mean just blanketing your world with it to prevent cancer. That's a very directed, specific, intentional exposure to an agent, to an exposure that causes an effect that they're trying to get. But you'd never just douse the water system with a drug, right?
Mhm.
You Because children, the elderly, the medically vulnerable will have uh, different results from that. And actually, the way they do tumor treating fields is they have these things they put on a cap on your head. There's some research where they to deliver chemotherapy into your brain, they're using non-ionizing radiation to help open up the membranes to allow the drugs in. And what scientists are saying is, what about how if there's impacts to the blood-brain barrier, which have been shown in several studies, what does that mean for lead exposure or toxic metals or any of these harmful agents that we know are harmful in our environment? Will they be more accessible in the brain? And there is research that has found more lead levels, more cell phone radiation exposure, more ADHD symptomology in kids.
Really because of the constant exposure. Right? These are all the factors that Dr. Belayev was telling me that are rarely tested in such a great number. We're lucky that if they test 2 or 3 different factors. So a lot of studies out there are concluding that this form of radiation is neutral or even beneficial, but they don't look at who the people are being tested, what they're being exposed to. Um,
Well, the Ramazzini Institute did research looking at non-ionizing radiation and known toxic agents and found a potentiation of the effects, more tumors in the animals that were exposed to the combination of non-ionizing radiation and a toxic exposure.
mhm. In closing, because time is flying and we're all busy, but I'd like to ask you, to respond a little bit to the criticism out there. I have a French, last week I was on Que Choisir, which is UFC, the largest consumer association for millions of people in France. And again, unfortunately, it was a 2005 article saying that, for instance, the Bioinitiative report, which summarized, I think, over 4,000 different papers, was shot down, demolished by the Danish government, the British government, saying there's a selection bias, cherry picking, and also that besides Dr. Carpenter, who was the co-author, Cindy Sage is someone who is a consultant in the field of EMF mitigation. So governments and industry are having a field day shooting down the Bioinitiative report. What can you say
Yes,
to that?
they are, and it's when you undo the covers again, when you look inside at what's going on, a lot of that those attacks on the bioinitiative and attacks on Dr. Joel Moskowitz and Dr. Devra Davis and all the scientists who are working hard on this have a basis in industry-funded groups, online blogs, and really lack substance when you look at the current body of research. Because Dr. Henry Lai published, and it's on the Bioinitiative report, a review of the impacts to neurological studies. He actually did several different endpoints and looked at what effect versus non-effect, industry studies versus non-industry studies. And the research just keeps showing more often than not an adverse effect when you look at the independent, non-industry funded science. So when I hear, oh, the bioinitiative's been shot down and all of these things, that's, first of all, it's outdated. And look at the body of science right now. Then you have Dr. Henry Lai, who, when he found DNA damage years ago, was, money was threatened to be taken away from him. There were attempts made to discredit his research, and he continues on documenting the existence of research which shows effects. And that article is a very important one. It's from several years ago, but it's a tale that has been told time and time again. Scientist after scientist who has found effect has suffered similar attacks on their credibility.
Follow the money. It's always the same thing. I was writing about toxic carpets 20 years ago. And Rosalind Anderson, who did the testing in her lab with the US military bioassay test developed by her mentor, who was a former Montrealer, her reputation was shut down. So they do the same thing. It's like Monsanto and the PR company sitting down, they're saying, okay, another study. Well, we're going to do everything we can to shoot down the credibility of the scientists, and also the funding runs out overnight. And sometimes they have labs that burned, which is what happened to Rosalind Anderson.
Wow.
In New Hampshire, I believe. So it's nothing new. The scientists who do bio studies on the bioeffects of electricity are treated the same as those who say pesticides or tobacco is dangerous. It's out of the PR 101 playbook.
The wargaming of the science, that is what was a term that was actually used by Motorola. It was a conversation between a Motorola public relations and Motorola, and they talked about wargaming the lies sing. I just pulled that up on my screen too, wargaming the science, and on to Microwaves News' latest coverage of Lurkel and Dr. Adelkofer and that whole saga, which is another example of wargaming the science that finally has seen the light of day, I would say.
There was another very recent paper, I forgot which one, but we're being swamped every month. There's really important stuff coming out. It's hard to follow all the news. But the governments are starting to come on board, like we saw Switzerland.
Yes, and the Netherlands report on 5G is recommending against the 28 gigahertz because of lack of safety data. Unfortunately, there are many governments that took a pause to review the issue of 5G and then put forward all of this industry-funded information and then decided to move forward. Thankfully, in France, the federal health agency ANSES is amidst a review of on the issue of 5G, and we await their final report. So there's a lot going on, and different countries are tackling this in different ways. But we really need oversight to what's happening on this issue, because right now there's so much industry influence into the so-called authorities that it's hard for governments to make decisions when their own agencies, which are captured by industry, are saying there's no problem and ignoring the science, like the Federal Communications did, which is why we launched our legal appeal to the FCC.
Yeah, tell us about that.
So when the FCC determined in 2019, at the end of the 2019, that their 1996 limits did not need to be changed, that we could keep the same thresholds they had, keep the way they test, not testing touching the body, and tests that only measure for thermal. We filed a legal appeal, uh, and we just had oral arguments. We had briefs that were submitted by Environmental Health Trust. We worked jointly with there's actually 14 petitioners in the case because Children's Health Defense and a total of 14 petitioners also filed a legal appeal. We responded to the FCC, who responded to us, and we had oral arguments, which is when the judges can ask questions of the FCC and of our counsel. And that was on the 25th of January. It went really well in that it was clear that the judges read the briefs and understood the issue. They understood what a thermally based limits were. They understood that our current limits don't address cumulative exposures. So we're awaiting a decision in that case. It really is historic, and it's on our website at ehtrust.org, Environmental Health Trust et al. Versus the FCC.
Oh, I was just showing it. I didn't share it, did I? Are you
Yeah,
not seeing this? No?
yeah, we have all the, yes, I can see it.
Okay.
We have the briefs, and there's challenges around the world, in India, in the United Kingdom, and in several countries. They are now many legal actions happening related to 5G and cell phones. And of course, we have in the United States actually a case, consolidated cases of people that have developed brain tumors in the place nearest to where they held the phone for years. They used the cell phone for years, and those consolidated cases have been winding through the courts for over a decade now. But
It's
we
taking
believe
a long
that,
time, eh? Here you see from Arthur Furstenberg's website in 1993, 3 federal American agencies were saying that the thermal base limits are out of date, seriously flawed. 1993, we're still waiting.
yeah, and actually, key staff at the EPA and at other US government agencies wrote a letter in 1999 and later in the early 2000s
Hmm.
stating that our FCC limits have all of these problems related to averaging, to the thermal basis, to how different tissues absorb radiation.
Hmm.
That was all ignored. Their questions were never answered because,
On your website, I guess, also?
yes, in fact, it's a key part of our case, because the FCC is saying that sister agencies, that's their term, are validating their decision. But when we look at the record, we don't actually see that. We see the Department of the Interior has a letter which says FCC limits are outdated. We see these letters from the Interagency Radiofrequency Work Group, which are documenting problems with the limits.
Can you
Not
send me, can you tell me where to find that
sure.
99 report by the
It's
EPA?
actually letters that were written
Yeah.
to the IEEE and because the United States adopted limits based on NCRP and IEEE limits, and these were letters written by the work group. I'll pull it up here.
So I'll stop sharing so you can show it.
Okay, wait. Okay, let me share the screen. I think I can't now because you're sharing.
I thought I stopped. Sorry about that. Okay, here you go.
Okay, so this is the EPA page, and then um, on this page, I document the changes to the EPA website, and then we also have this letter, the U.S. Radiofrequency Interagency Workgroup letter to Richard Tell. That's from 1999, and members of the work group detailed key issues related to the radiofrequency radiation guidelines.
So there's nothing new, huh?
Yeah.
What other websites do you recommend? If some people are saying, oh, these people are activists, I want to get, a credible source. Who are the independent sources that you could recommend people read if they're skeptical?
Well, there's, as you showed, Physicians for Safe Technology and Prevent Cancer Now. But I would say, I think the best thing to do is to go to the science and share the science. I know that what ends up happening is people say, oh, that's too much. I can't read all that science. But it's either one or the other. You want to read the science? Here's the science. You don't want to read the science? You want it to be translated for you? Do you want industry to translate it for you? Or do you want groups who are independent? We are not a for-profit group. We're a nonprofit. Most of the work we do is volunteer-based, in fact, and you can just go right here and read, studies that actually, I wish that that was open access. But this is published research evaluating the science. So it's right there in PubMed.
Not Club Med, but PubMed.
Right.
I like the ORSA website out of
Oh, yes.
Australia. Some people could say, well, they're activists, but they have the best data. When I'm looking at a specific organ, I just send an email out to Steve, not Steve Weller, I confused the two, but
Victor Leach.
Victor Leach. Vic Leach.
Yes, yes,
Vic is amazing. And he's
yes.
available also. He responds so fast, and he can tell me in a minute how many different papers for cell towers or specific organs. Vic Leach, yeah.
Yeah, here's their webpage. It's an excellent, he's a radiation physicist.
Yeah.
And you can search in the database, and it's an excellent resource.
It's a little tricky actually doing the search. You have to read the guide, but as a lazy reporter and a non-scientist, I'm lazy, and I send him an email, and he's really gracious and generous because it's a really complete but also complex database. There's also EMF portal out of Germany.
True.
That one also has all the medical therapies using EMFs. So it can be a little confusing when people say there's 30,000 studies out there. Well, they also include those 30,000, the beneficial effects of targeted specific doses.
Static fields as well. There's so much out there. And it all paints a picture clearly showing, that there's a body of evidence and hundreds of scientists that are calling for us to reduce exposure to non-ionizing radiation, not increase it, as 5G will do, as has been shown. We have a page here under science where we have different medical groups that have come out, what they say. There was the consensus statement of United Kingdom and international medical scientific experts. And we try to keep track of these groups so that when people come on to this issue, they have a place to go. Like, here's a list on the side that links to these different actions by different groups: the Vienna Medical Association, Belgium, Cyprus, the Pan-Cyprian. There's also the Athens Medical Association, the California Department of Health recommendations, which were really suppressed for a decade.
Well, yeah, let's get back to Joel Moskowitz. So maybe
Yes, and Joel,
his website, Safer EMR, is
yeah,
really also with your website, the one that I use the most.
yes.
Safer EMR. He is head of the University of California. What is it? It's a family medicine,
Public health at University at Berkeley, uh,
right?
a public health department there,
So
and he
he
has
sued the state.
Safer EMR
He
is his
sued the
website.
public health department, right? Because they were not publishing their brief on.
He what?
He actually sued the state because they were hiding this information.
Yes. So the California Department of Health started developing uh, an advisory on how to reduce exposure to cell phone and cordless phone radiation actually a decade ago, but they never released it for years and years. And he had to file a FOIA and did legal action to have them release it. They also released all the drafts. And if you look at the drafts, what's so interesting
That's important.
is, yeah, the early drafts were for the workers of California. It was not a public health, here's how you reduce exposure
Yeah.
for the public. It was the workers need to have reduced exposure. We need to offer um, equipment that is safer. We need to educate them about phones and cordless phones. And we need to buy equipment for our workers. I mean, that's amazing. And all of that was redrafted out. And then they came out with this, I'm sorry to say, watered down, yet it's still quite good advisory, better than some of the best we have in the United States, I would say. They talk about why children are more vulnerable to cell phone radiation.
Mhm.
They give recommendations on how to reduce. They even explain, here's when your phone goes to high power. You should reduce times when you use a phone at very high power. And they explain situations and scenarios where you can have increased exposures. So
When
that's excellent. Except they cut out core information on cordless phones, and they really cut out the whole point, which is about occupational exposure.
Incredible.
But
Well, Theodora, thank you very much for doing this. I invite people to visit your website, environmentalhealthtrust.org, EHTrust. It's a wealth of information, and I commend you for the work you're doing. Keep me posted. I'm just a housing reporter and publisher of a magazine on healthy and sustainable housing for nearly 30 years. So EMFs is just a sideline, but it's such an important issue. I should be on this full time. My readers, some of them are tired of me writing about EMFs, but I keep knocking on the nail, hitting the nail, and people are starting to move. We have a city in Quebec subsidizing EMF inspections.
really, what city is that?
Victoriaville, they should be up on your website.
Yes, I need to put that on my website. I need
Just one of many actions when you're building or renovating, green and healthy stuff. And it's because they read my magazine, and they were advised by a friend of mine who was the former president of the Order of Architects. So people are starting to listen. That's encouraging, because it's obvious that governments and those who fund government have a lot more power than scientists and activists, but the message is really getting across more and more. So thank you very much for what you're doing.
Thank you so much for everything you're doing to elevate the discussion.
It's a pleasure. It's an honor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.